So without further ado, I will hand it over to our guest speakers.
So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a wonderful experience to be here with all of you. It's my first time with the Paideia Institute, so I really appreciated the invitation. And thank you very much also for the introduction. I'm going to share some slides. Just a second. In which I try to explain, let's say, the fundamentals of the problem. So the main problem at stake in the volume, as well as in our lectures, is whether and to what extent the biopolitics existed in ancient times, and especially in classical antiquity. And this is, let's say, the main problem at stake in our volume, in which we try from different angles, from literature, history, philosophy, and political theory, to address this main issue. In my lecture, I will focus on the main authors who have addressed the problem, namely Michel Foucault and Giorgio Agamben. Foucault and Agamben are the main sources of inspiration when it comes to biopolitics, especially in relation to the history of this phenomenon. At the end of the lecture, I will mention a few research problems that are still very relevant in our research. So let's start first with Michel Foucault. If we look at Michel Foucault, we can see that he discusses the problem of biopolitics in relation to modernity. Modernity for him means roughly starting from the 17th, 18th century. And very schematically, we can say that he focuses on the problem of biopolitics in relation to three aspects, namely, first, the difference between sovereignty, sovereign power, and higher power. Second, the connection biopolitics and liberalism. And then third, the connection higher politics and racism. In my lecture, I will focus on the first aspect, since it is very helpful when it comes to explaining the specific meaning of this phenomenon. So what is biopower? What is biopolitics? And in his book, The History of Sexuality, the first volume, an introduction, he clarifies how the difference between sovereign power and biopower. Now, let's have a look, first of all, at how he defines sovereignty and sovereign power. Essentially, let's say very oversimplifying, how decide life and death. So it is an absolute power over, let's say, the life and death of individuals. Another formulation used by Michel Foucault is that power, the sovereign power is the power of life and death, in the sense that it's a right to take life and let live. It's a very violent power. It's a power in the sense of seizure and deduction. So the sovereign has the right to take everything, essentially, even life. And this is, in a certain way, the old form of power, essentially, before, let's say, modernity. When it comes to modernity, we have the emergence of a new form of power, and this is what he calls biopower, namely power over life. What is the difference in relation to sovereignty and sovereign power? It's not violent. So biopower, essentially, at a conceptual level, if we have to define it, it's not a violent form of power. It's a power that fosters and administers life. So think of all forms of influence and power to facilitate life, to implement security policy, and so on. And this is what is really at stake for Michel Foucault in modernity. Specifically, this form of power focuses on the biological existence of human beings. That's why the emphasis lies on bios, or the bios, in the sense of the biological life of human beings. And this is the main object at stake in modernity, according to Michel Foucault. Let's see how he develops so this understanding of biopower and modernity. And let's move to the following slides. He differentiates essentially two forms of biopower, namely what he calls an anatomy of the human body, and this is, let's say, the first form of biopower, and the second one is biopolitics in a very specific sense. So in a few minutes, I will explain what is the difference between biopower and biopolitics. At the moment, we can say that biopolitics is a specific form of biopower, which is focusing and addressing, I'd say, a plurality of human beings, a society, in a certain way. He also differentiates various ways in which the anatomopolitics and biopolitics have been implemented. So the specific ways in which anatomopolitics have been implemented in modernity is what he calls the disciplines of the body. While the specific manners in which the biopolitics of a society is implemented, is enacted, is, let's say, regulation. And has to give some very concrete examples. When it comes to the discipline of the body, you can think of, let's say, phenomena such as army, schools. And what is relevant here? Foucault says, when it comes to the discipline of the body, what is relevant is the individual. Okay, so the first form is a form of biopower focusing on the individuals as such. And this shaping and managing of the individuals takes place in schools, at universities, in army, and so on. The second form, namely regulation, or to be much more accurate, the regulations of populations, is about health, resources, fertility rate, namely all phenomena of a society as a whole. It's in a certain way a global view on society, while, let's say, the discipline are, let's say, focusing on individuals as such. Of course, such a differentiation is very abstract. I mean, it's a conceptual, let's say, differentiation. In reality, you can clearly see an overlap and an intersection of, let's say, the disciplines and the regulations. Okay, so disciplines and regulations are globally what forms, let's say, the core of biopower and modernity. Now, a few words on the difference biopower and biopolitics, since not clear, and in Foucault himself, it's not very clear how we should differentiate biopower from biopolitics. I suggest oversimplifying such a differentiation. We can say that biopower is the global phenomenon, while biopolitics is a very specific, a very specific form of it. Sometimes Michel Foucault uses them as a synonymous. I mean, for instance, here in this passage, he says biopower is defined as the set of mechanisms through which the basic biological features of the human species have become the object of a political strategy. And here, it's not, I mean, so the difference, biopower and biopolitics is not so sharp. In a certain way, they are used as equivalent. Okay. Sometimes students also ask me, what is the difference? I mean, it depends on how we use them. This for the sake of clarity. Now, let's focus on this text from Michel Foucault, in which he mentions Aristotle and the problem of the biological modernity. What he says here, first of all, he identifies three sorts of modernity, okay? And he says very briefly that for millennia, human beings have been and have remained what they were for Aristotle, namely living animals with a capacity of a political existence. While in modernity, human beings still are living animals, but the biological, let's say, features of human beings have become an explicit object of analysis and management. Okay, so very roughly, very oversimplifying, for Foucault, we don't have a biopolitics in ancient times, since the biological features of human beings have not yet been a specific and explicit object of managing. And this is, let's say, the summary of what he thinks of the relationship between modernity and biopolitics. And this is how the narrative have been very influential for a long time. Then, at a certain point, Italian Agamben has introduced a new, let's say, a new understanding of biopower. And let's say the main source is his book Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Higher Life, which has been published in English in 1998. What is very interesting in Agamben, in his understanding of those phenomena, is that he starts from ancient philosophy, especially from Aristotle. Okay. At the beginning of his book, Homo Sacer, he claims that ancient philosophers have differentiated essentially two forms of, let's say, two meanings of life. Zoe, namely the simple fact of living, life in the biological sense, in this fundamental sense, and bios, namely life within a community. Okay. You can say that his understanding of biopower and the history of biopolitics is essentially founded in this, let's say, differentiation. Right? He claims we can find in Aristotle, essentially, and in Plato and in other ancient sources. However, such a differentiation is not so self-evident. You have a number of philosophers and philologists that say Zoe and bios, I mean, it's very difficult. It's in principle very hard to find such a differentiation explicitly in Plato and in Aristotle. And many argue that this is, let's say, a very philosophical way of reading ancient sources. Okay, but let's say, despite such a philological problems, let's see how he develops his understanding of biopolitics in ancient times. One of his theses is that, you can see here in the first quote, he says, in the classical world, however, simple natural life, namely the Zoe, is excluded from a community in a very specific sense. So the Zoe, the natural life, the biological life, let's say, is as its own site, and this is the oikos, home, while, let's say, the polis, the political, as its own site in the city. So on the basis of such a differentiation, namely Zoe, Bios, polis, and oikos, he constructs his way of seeing a history of biopower, essentially in the West. He also focuses a very famous account of human being as a political animal, and he claims that essentially in such account, namely zone politikon, we see such an intersection. When he says that we have to differentiate Zoe and Bios, it's not really a sharp differentiation. Okay, so he assumes that we have to differentiate Zoe and Bios, but then he analyzes, or at least he claims to analyze, what are the different ways of intersecting Zoe and Bios. Here, Agamben is also referring to Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault remains a central source of inspiration for him. You see here that in the last quote on the slides, he says, he summarizes how the process by which at the threshold of the modern era, natural life, namely Zoe, begins to be included in these mechanisms and strategies of the state power. And politics turns into biopolitics, namely a politics focusing on the biological life of human beings. Okay, and the species and the individual as a simple living body have become what is at stake, really, when it comes to society. And this is, let's say, how he appropriates Michel Foucault's thesis on this phenomenon. Again, here, he says, the entry of the Zoe, namely the biological life, into the sphere of the polis, the politicization of bare life as such, is, in the wake of Michel Foucault, the decisive event of modernity. So here, he summarizes what Michel Foucault says, and signals a radical transformation of, let's say, the notions of the classical thought. Okay. And now we see that he revises at the same time a Foucauldian way of understanding biopolitics. And what is, let's say, the difference? That Agamben thinks that biopolitics and sovereignty are essentially one and the same phenomenon. So while Foucault says that we have or differentiates sovereignty, sovereign power from biopower, Agamben claims that at the end of the day, sovereign power, biopower are one and the same phenomenon. You can clearly see here. He says, so the present inquiry is about this hidden point of intersection. He means the intersection of, let's say, all the way of understanding sovereignty, namely a formal institutional way, and then, let's say, the new way, namely a biopolitical approach. He claims that, he argues that we have to see this intersection. We cannot separate them. And this is, let's say, one of the, let's say, the main problems at stake in his history of such a phenomena. Then, at the end of this passage, he underlines that it can even, he said, that the production of a biopolitical body is the original activity of sovereignty. You can clearly see here how he conflates biopower and sovereignty as one and the same phenomenon, which also means that biopower is also an ancient phenomenon. It's not only a phenomenon that we can see in modernity. Here I offer you a very oversimplifying and schematically a scheme to understand how very roughly he understands such a phenomenon. So we have here the differentiation, the natural life and the political life. And what is most interesting in his account is the notion of bare life. And the bare life is, let's say, the object of biopower for Agamben. You see that the bare life is, in a certain way, it lies at the intersection of the natural life and the life within a community. And such an intersection, such a very obscure, enigmatic intersection is what is at stake for him when it comes to the history of power. Of course, he elaborates on this problem. I mean, I've tried to, let's say, to visualize it, but what is really at stake in his philosophy is really such an intersection, such a very intricate, obscure, in a certain way, intersection of the biological life and life within a community. So, summarizing, in Foucault, we have the introduction of this new notions of biopower, a new way of looking at politics, which has been very fruitful for many scholars. On the other hand, he confines himself to modernity. And this is maybe a problem, since his follower, Agamben, shows that we cannot really look at biopolitics only in modernity. We do find forms of biopolitics in ancient time as well. On the other hand, in Agamben, we have certain problems, namely, he introduces the notion of exception and bare life, which for many philosophers remain very abstract. So many scholars, many philosophers argue that when it comes to the history of such an intricate phenomena, the notion of bare life and exception, I don't turn out really very helpful. And this is maybe a problem that we can discuss later, okay? At the end of my lecture, I want to give you some insight into very recent, let's say, analysis of this phenomenon. And I refer to Michel Hangas, who, in a certain way, has, let's say, suggested a revision of the history of this phenomenon. He argues that we do find in ancient times forms of biopolitics, even if we cannot really adopt the notion of higher life, since we have to have a look at the historical, let's say, nuances of such a phenomenon. Okay, and he is one of the authors included in the volume that we have published last year. Okay, you see here, biopolitics is not a distinctively modern phenomenon. And this is a thesis that somehow follows a new understanding of the problem in a certain way. Okay, now I stop here, and then I leave the floor to Jussi. I hope that my very oversimplified account of Foucault and Agamben has been hopefully helpful.
Absolutely, no, it's fantastic, and
okay,
we'll return to it later for the questions. Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Antonio, for this wonderful introduction, and my warmest thanks also go out to the Paideia Institute and Allegra Forbes and the others who have made this possible, and thanks for the opportunity to address you today. And also greetings from Finland. Yes, I will also share some slides to illustrate my talk. I hope you can see them. Screen sharing, yes. Okay, so I will just briefly continue from where Antonio left off. And also my talk is based on my contribution to our recent volume, which Antonio already advertised, Politics and Ancient Thought. So yes, Antonio also already very well explained the basic concepts of biopolitics and biopower. Biopolitics, as the exercise of biopower, consists briefly in governmental and administrative technologies and interventions aimed at citizens as members of a biological population, concerning functions such as sexuality, reproduction, heredity, health, disease, hygiene, natality, mortality, and in some notorious cases also eugenic considerations. So this is Foucault's understanding of what biopolitics is. Biopolitics is primarily a modern phenomenon that coincides with the emergence of the modern biological and social sciences since the late 18th century, and is also connected to the rise of modern industrial capitalism and the powerful surveillance machinery of the modern disciplinary state, as Foucault characterizes it. For Foucault, biopolitics is centered around the modern biological concept of population. Now, Foucault's established interpretation of biopower and biopolitics as distinctly modern phenomena has since been questioned and challenged by several thinkers and scholars, notably by Giorgio Agamben, whom Antonio discussed, who searches the conceptual roots of modern biopolitics in ancient and medieval thought. But also the Finnish scholar, my colleague Mika Ojakangas, in his book on the Greek origins of biopolitics, makes the thesis that Platonic and Aristotelian political thought are already thoroughly biopolitical. So this thesis was kind of the main kind of source of inspiration for our volume. We want to discuss this precise thesis. Now it's clear that in the ancient political communities there are undeniably biopolitical administrative practices, as there are most probably in all historical human political communities. You find biopolitical practices in the wide sense. So we know that the Greek city-states, as well as the Roman Republic, had different strategies concerning for example, the number and the biological qualities, health, reproduction, hereditary considerations of their citizens. Plutarch, in his parallel lives, in the life of Solon, he tells us that Athens had, since the time of Solon, marriage laws to promote the fruitfulness of marriage and the number of children, and so on. In his life of Lycurgus, he tells us that ancient Sparta actually practiced a kind of policy of state eugenics, in which newborns were examined by state officials. And if, quote, ill-born, agenes, and deformed, amorphon, the newborns were, according to Plutarch, left for exposure at the foot of Mount Taygetus, in the conviction that the life of that which nature had not well equipped and at the very beginning for health and strength was of no advantage either to itself or to the state, the polis. Now, whether this is factually true is debated, but many sources agree that the Spartans practiced some kind of eugenic infanticide. It is also a well-known fact that biopolitical techniques are present in the political theories of Plato and Aristotle. So in Plato's Republic and the Laws, you find principles regarding the breeding of well-born Euphues citizens through regulation of sexual partners, medicine, nutrition, etc. And Plato even recommends letting the ill-born die and actively putting to death those with ill-natured souls, with which Plato seems to mean various types of psychiatric disorders. Ojakangas in his book describes Plato's the policies recommended by Plato as biomeritocratic state racism, very bluntly. Aristotle is more moderate regarding eugenics, but even he notes in his Politics that the quantity and the natural quality of the inhabitants is one of the first concerns of the polis. I'm not an expert on actual political practices in antiquity. I focus on political theory, and that's what I will focus on here. So I'm unfortunately unable to tell you more about this actual existing biopolitical practices in the Greek cities. But in our volume, Kathy L. Gaza has a very interesting but also quite disturbing chapter on the different kinds of biopolitical practices, especially in connection to wars in antiquity. So I recommend Gaza's Ojakangas's and Gaza's chapters in our volume on the actual biopolitical practices in antiquity. Now, Ojakangas in his book further argues that in addition to including these biopolitical techniques, the Platonic and Aristotelian political theories were inherently and fundamentally biopolitical in their ideals. And this is now the thesis that I will examine here more closely. I quote Ojakangas, the conception of politics as the regulation of the living in the name of the security and happiness of the state is as old as Western political thought itself. The political philosophical categories of classical thought, particularly those of Plato and Aristotle, were already biopolitical categories. Now this I want to take issue with. According to Ojakangas, this is because the aim and end of politics was for Plato and Aristotle the same as in modern biopolitics, namely the happiness, Greek eudaimonia, of the citizens. And the biopolitical measures that they discuss are primarily a means to this ultimate end, means to attaining happiness. This is what Ojakangas argues, and this notion of happiness as the end of end of politics. This is what I want to focus on. So, indeed, Aristotelian political theory, with its medieval reverberations, does revolve around the ideal of human happiness in the sense of fulfillment, prosperity, or flourishing, eudaimonia, Latin beatitudo, and the highest good, summum bonum, for the human being. However, as Foucault himself notes in his lectures, while in the Aristotelian and medieval model, the state is an instrument for making possible a happiness that itself transcends the political community. In other words, the state is a means for making people happy. For the modern state, by contrast, the happiness of subjects becomes an instrument for strengthening state power. So the modern state wants to make people happy in order to make the state stronger. So happiness is an instrument to use of the state, which is a major fundamental difference. Aristotle, in the first book of his Politics, points out that the city-state, the polis, which is the most developed type of human community, aims at the supreme type of human good. So while inferior communities such as the household, oikia, and the village aim at mere survival, the preservation of life, as such, the polis, the city-state, exists for the sake of a specific and qualified good life, a happy life. The polis is not a mere economic, military, or judicial conglomeration of individuals, but rather it qualitatively transforms the life of the citizens. Only as citizens of a polis do individuals have access to a complete and self-sufficient mode of life, according to Aristotle. So perfect human happiness or flourishing is not possible without the polis. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle maintains that there is one single mode of life, one single bios that is universally ideal, maximally fulfilling and happy for all humans. And this supreme way of life must be based on the exercise of the supreme human excellence or virtue. Aristotle presents two main candidates for the best way of life. First, the life of public, political, participation, Biopolitics, which is based on the exercise of practical wisdom or prudence, phronesis. Second, the life of contemplation, Bios Theoreticos, the life of the philosopher, which is based on the virtue of theoretical wisdom, Sophia. Now in Nicomachean Ethics 10, this question is then resolved. Aristotle shows that the contemplative life is supreme. I cannot go into his argument, but according to Aristotle, disinterested contemplation of permanent and necessary truths is the maximally self-sufficient, complete and fulfilling human activity. Primarily because it's the most self-sufficient activity. This is the main criterion. Contemplation is the closest approximation of human existence to the mode of being of the metaphysical divinity, who for Aristotle is the most perfect, complete and sufficient living being, whose being consists in perfect self-awareness, in intellectual thought, thinking itself. This is Aristotle's God. Thus, the contemplative activity of the philosopher maximally transcends the finitude of human life and human affairs and brings to it a degree of divine immortality. As such, however, the contemplative life is no longer properly a human mode of life, but rather a superhuman and divine mode of life. The optimal happiness, eudaimonia, the best life that constitutes the ultimate aim of the political community is thus essentially solitary, self-sufficient, as well as superhuman. Thus, the ultimate end of politics for Aristotle transcends the political realm of human affairs, the human community, as well as the finitude of human life in general. So the ultimate aim of politics is something that is transcendent to politics. That is the main takeaway. Just a brief note on Thomas Aquinas, who in his treatise on kingship transposes this Aristotelian ideal into the medieval Christian and monarchical framework. Thomas argues that the ultimate happiness, beatitudo, as the final end of human existence, is the attainment after death of the contemplation of divine perfection, which is also, as the ultimate end of the human will, an enjoyment of God's perfection. The contemplative enjoyment of God is the ultimate human good for Aquinas. And the fundamental function of the temporal state, the temporal government of the king for Aquinas is to, quote, promote the good life of the multitude in such a way as to make it suitable for the attainment of heavenly beatitude. So the ultimate end of the government of the king, unsurprisingly, lies in the transcendent hereafter, the salvation of souls. So, in sum, it can be said that Western political thought, in terms of its ideals, is not biopolitical. In the Aristotelian tradition, it only becomes truly and completely biopolitical at the point where the transcendence of Aristotelian political theory is abandoned. At the point where politics becomes biopolitical, at the point where civic happiness as the ultimate end and aim of politics becomes immanent to the biological and the political realms of life. And this, I argue, takes place most clearly in the works of Thomas Hobbes, his main works on the Citizen and Leviathan, which in many ways inaugurate modern political thought. Yes, just a couple of more minutes to wrap up my point. So in the Leviathan, Hobbes maintains that the final cause, end, or design for the sake of which human beings subject themselves to the commonwealth, to the sovereign government of the king, is the foresight of their own preservation and of a more contented life thereby. So according to Hobbes, humans established through a wholly artificial covenant a civil government in order to escape the state of nature, which is a constant state of war resulting from the selfish natural passions of human beings. Hobbes, in difference to Aristotle and Aquinas, maintains that there is no ultimate, utmost aim, no summum bonum for humans. Human desire shifts its object constantly and finds no ultimate fulfillment anywhere. However, for Hobbes, there is a highest evil, a summum malum, which is violent death. And it's the avoidance of this supreme evil, the avoidance of violent death, that is the purpose of the Commonwealth for Hobbes. Individuals are motivated by fear of death to establish a Commonwealth, together with the desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living and a hope by their industry to obtain them. So for Hobbes, civic welfare or safety does not mean simply the preservation of life in general, but rather the safeguarding of happy and maximally pleasurable life. However, for Hobbes, this happiness amounts to nothing more than materially commodious, comfortable, contented living. So what the state can do for human beings is to protect them, protect their life, and protect them from each other, and leave them the liberty of privately pursuing whatever it is that they desire, private happiness, and to enjoy harmless liberty that is harmless to others. So this is civic happiness for Hobbes, and this is the liberal, basic liberal modern model of politics. In this model, civic happiness becomes identified as preservation of life for the pursuit of maximal enjoyment and contentment, primarily in the form of private pursuit of private wealth. Hannah Arendt, in The Human Condition, argues that contemporary consumer society is dominated by the late modern human being whose principal activities are labor and consumption, sustaining and enjoying biological life. In modernity, life itself becomes the greatest good, and the supreme principle of happiness is the utilitarian maxim of greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Happiness being here understood simply as the optimization of the subjective quality of biological life as such. So Arendt, without using the term biopolitics, also argues that that modernity has succumbed to a biopolitical ideal where life itself and the optimization of the quality of life become the greatest good available to human beings. What's understood by happiness is essentially quality of life. Okay, I'm out of time, but just to sum up, the presence of biopolitical techniques in ancient political thought is obvious. However, the underlying rationale for these biopolitical measures is the overall understanding of the ideals and ends of politics. In ancient and medieval Aristotelianism, as in modernity, the ideal end of politics is human happiness. However, in the Aristotelian tradition, this happiness ultimately consists in an extraordinary mode of life that is transcendent to the political community and to ordinary human life as such. So on the level of ideals and ends, I want to claim that ancient and medieval political theory is not yet biopolitical. By contrast, in the modern post-Hobbesian tradition, the end of political government and civic happiness becomes wholly immanent to the biological life process itself. The end of politics becomes the preservation of life as such, and happiness is understood as the optimization of the subjective quality of life. And then a further claim that could be made, I won't make it here, is that the modern focus on the immanent biological quality of the life process as an end in itself also gives rise to the modern eugenicist notion of life unworthy of being lived. So it's only in modernity that eugenic purification, racialist ideology can become the very substance of the political community as it did in the Nazi state. So this, even though ancient Sparta in many ways was a eugenic, maybe had eugenic policies, perhaps it was a practice state racism, it still was racism and eugenicism were not the substance of political life, even in Sparta, I would claim. But here I can't really justify this argument, so I will stop here and try to leave some time for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Backman and Professor Cimino, again, for your fantastic contributions on this subject, which are also helpfully very clear and concise for those of us who are not full-time philosophers. So to start the Q&A section, I would actually like to introduce a question that I've pretty much been thinking about since we announced the talk, because I'm fascinated by ways in which we can bring Foucault and Agamben into discourse with the ancients. So I was wondering, and this I think is kind of adjacent to biopolitics. So I think in recent years, Foucault's theorization of the panopticon as a paradigm of internalized governmentality and surveillance has really entered the mainstream discourse. I mean, maybe not every person you ask on the street, but like there are people on YouTube talking about TikTok as the panopticon. It's very it's really entered spaces that are non-academic or not strictly scholarly in the traditional sense. So I'm wondering, because of course, it resonates so clearly with, the existence that we all share of a highly accelerated capitalist and digital industrial era, probably even more than it would have resonated in Foucault's time. I'm wondering if you think this is an exclusively post-industrial modern paradigm, or would it also have parallels in antiquity? Or in short, have we always felt this way of being subjugated from within and the sort of internal surveillance and governmentality? Or is this a paradigm that is unique to contemporary existence? And I'm hoping perhaps the two of you will have different answers to this question, because I think your approaches are slightly different. So I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Shall I start, you see? I mean, Foucault and Agamben are also philosophers. So of course, they also have historical claims. As a historian of philosophy, I think that we should also, let's say, have insight into the historical situations. I mean, we cannot really apply one notion, one concept to all historical circumstances. So I have no a unique answer. I mean, I have no just one answer to it. I mean, I think that we should have a look really at the phenomena in their own specific situation. I think we cannot simply apply philosophically, apply a notion and then try to construct a global view on history. I think that Agamben and Foucault are very inspiring and very useful, even if they might be wrong. But nevertheless, they are useful in the sense that they draw attention to certain problems. And then, of course, it's the duty and the task of the historian to have a look at the historical, let's say, nuances. That's my, let's say, my view in general on those topics.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, if I may just very briefly add to this very comprehensive answer. I mean, this the emergence of the so-called disciplinary surveillance society, the society of the panopticon. That's for Foucault. It's largely a kind of technological question. So it's kind of it's also a matter of when states actually have the necessary technology to create a panopticon society. So you need a certain degree of technological development to do that, which obviously didn't exist in antiquity. But also Foucault connects it to the kind of economic reality of industrial capitalism. So it's mainly in an industrial society that you really need to constantly watch people and make them internalize a certain degree of self-discipline in order to make them productive workers in the closed environment of factories. So it's hugely an economic, and it's Foucault sees this in the terms of technology and economy, I would say largely. And in these regards, ancient society was very, very different, of course, economically and technologically.
Thank you. Yeah, so there, of course, in antiquity, there would have been certain technological limitations to, and modern surveillance would not have been able to be achieved at the same degree. Well, thank you. I was very curious about that. So we do have a few minutes left if hopefully others have some questions to contribute. You can raise your hand with the raise hand reaction or just unmute yourself and contribute.
Yes, I want to thank both of you for your presentations. And I have a query to consider. And when you were talking about particularly Mr. Backman, the idea of either the happiness, sonum bonum, or the sonum malum of the citizen, I thought about agrarian capitalism and slavery in the South, in the Southern United States. How would those two variables play out if individuals or communities are defined as non-citizens? If they're not considered to be citizens, then what would be the goal? Would it be their happiness? Would it be their non-happiness? How would they fit into that form? Because what you said has been, for me, very insightful as thinking of the plantation as kind of a neo-Roman structure. So I'm curious to your response to this kind of insight that's percolating in my mind now.
Thank you very much. So this was perhaps mainly a question for me. So you are asking, if I understand correctly, how these categories of supreme good and supreme evil, how they would apply to people who are enslaved.
And who are
yes.
who are defined as non-citizens. This is a key piece, is that they're not citizens.
Yes, well, as you know, of course, Aristotle himself lived in, unfortunately, lived in a slave-holding society, and this had, of course, a huge political significance for the polity, because you know the economic base was slavery, and then of course, I mean, the simple answer is that slaves do not have access to the supreme human good. They do not, because any kind of human good for Aristotle applies only to people who are free to choose their own ends and to live in accordance with some kind of end. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, he only discusses the kind of possible ends for people who are free, who are not enslaved, and it's clear that slaves are here simply the people who furnish the material economic substructure to allow this kind of choice of ends for people who are free from backbreaking labor, and this is clear. But then, of course, Aristotle is also clearly very troubled about the question of whether slavery is natural, whether human beings are, whether it is at all justified to enslave human beings, whether any people are naturally suited to slavery, or whether in the end all people should be free, and you know, his answer is ambiguous. But it's as to the conditions in the South, it's better that I don't even try to address those, because my competence is not sufficient. But of course, I mean, you know, it's you have a similar slavery. Obviously, had a very similar function in that society, even though it was society protected by the U.S. Constitution and the civic liberties provided by the U.S. Constitution. It's clear that's, you know, this was the huge problem for a lot of U.S. history, that these civil liberties did not extend to a certain part of the human population of the republic. But yeah, this is as much as I can say on this topic.
Thank you for that. That gives me the insight I'm looking for with both Aristotle and Aquinas. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Next, I think Mark has a question.
Yes, a speculative question coming up, but before I raise it, I wanted to thank you both for the talk, and I'm not as up on my Foucault philosophy as I would like to be. But perhaps mainly direct it to you, Professor Backman. I really think you're right about Hobbes marking a kind of transition point for modernism, particularly for the setup of the modern state as kind of a founding myth of the modern nation state, and that rejection of a transcendent goal or a summum bonum. And so my speculative question sort of has two parts. One, is that an absolutely lost cause, like to try to reinstate telos or a summum bonum or a transcendent goal? Is that just out of bounds altogether? And then secondly, is there, I mean, this is this really speculative part, but with the crisis of climate change and a focus again on a whole planetary structure, would that possibly allow an opening for the reintroduction of a highest good for all humanity?
Yes, okay. Thank you. Yes, Antonio, please add if you have something to contribute on this question. But just very brief answer by me. Yes, I mean, one thing I omitted for the lack of time in my presentation was to discuss Hannah Arendt. Actually, she proposes a new kind of summum bonum, which is different from both the ancient and the modern model. So of course, in modernity, we tend to think that there is no universal good that is the supreme good for all human beings. That's, we tend to think with Hobbes that everyone has their own private happiness. Whatever makes you happy may not be what makes me happy. So happiness becomes a private matter of preference and private desire. And this is how we tend to think in modernity. But Arendt, she kind of essentially proposes that political participation itself, to participate politically, that could be seen as a universal good. To participate in a political sphere of liberty as an equal with the other citizens, as an equal among equals, to participate politically in the public sphere, that could be construed as a new kind of universal summum bonum for everybody, that was kind of missed in both ancient and modern political theory. This is Arendt's claim, but I won't go into that. But then the other aspect of a question regarding climate change. I mean, that's still a kind of, climate change is framed as a question of survival still, isn't it? We want to combat. So climate change is a summum malum, precisely. It's a life-threatening phenomenon, and we wish to combat climate change for that reason, because it threatens our very existence, the existence of humankind, at least, as that's the way it's portrayed often in this catastrophe scenario. So in a sense, I don't entirely see how that could help us find a summum bonum, really, because it's kind of it's a Hobbesian type of summum malum that we want to avoid, and we think that the political community should protect us from this type of great evil represented by climate change. So it's I don't maybe entirely see how what you're thinking of, but
well,
yeah, okay,
that's extremely helpful. I guess part of me has always struggled with philosophy in the modern world, like ethics is just in the 20th century took a beating, but then the postmodern world is so fragmented. It's hard to sort of even imagine doing a ethical theory that people would come on board with. So if you don't like modernity and postmodernism, I don't know where to go. That's kind of my ultimate question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Then if there aren't any more questions, I think we can wrap up. We're right on time. So thank you so much again, Professor Backman and Professor Cimino, for your fantastic contributions today. And if anyone would like to share this lecture around to those who could not attend, it will be up on YouTube by tomorrow, depending on my work schedule, and I will send it around to everyone who registered. So it will be available, and yeah, we hope to see you again at the next installment of our lecture series. It's going to be about teaching the humanities in prisons, so perhaps we can, return to some of the questions that we investigated today next month. And of course, as always, I urge you all to apply for our in-person travel programs in Italy and in Greece this summer, which can be found on our website. And if you're in New York City next week, registration is still open for our Living Latin in New York City conference. So I have to say that for marketing. I always urge you to look into those things. So thank you again to everyone, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks
very
so
much.
much, and thanks to everybody for attending and the great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.